And we're live. Ace, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing wonderful. Thank you so much for having me back.
It is no problem. I always enjoy having you on. You are a wealth of knowledge. It's like talking to a literal computer in the best kind of way, like data, but it's more emotion.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I'm very excited what we're about to talk about. Yeah.
So it'd be great. Let me just set a link out real quick.
Oh yeah.
And then we'll boost it for a little bit so people can get in here because I don't want anybody to miss this.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. If you tag me in the link, then I'll retweet it.
Sounds good. There it is. And yep, you tagged and tweet. There we go.
Perfect.
So before we get into the topic of prison abolishment.
Yep.
Okay, there we go. I want to say real quick, you are a host on one of my favorite podcasts, Slurp Gang.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm so glad I finally found the one fan.
I am actually one of the few members of the Patreon.
Yes, we shouted you out. I believe we shouted you out during the episode we just recorded too. For that.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. You know, it's like I think that one and Tom Woods are the only ones that I can, and Contradentilas I listen to every week when they come out. It's like, no, this is what I do now. They are.
Well, we very much appreciate that. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
No problem. So, prison abolishment.
Yeah.
Why should we abolish prisons? Don't we need somewhere to put, bad people?
So yeah, this is probably the first question. Obviously, people have when they first hear about prison abolition. In fact, even a lot of libertarians, when they first hear about prison abolition, it's like when statists first hear about anarchism. It just doesn't really click in their heads why this would be a good thing generally. So I think when we're talking about like what would we do with like the rapists and the murderers, this is a very real concern and it does need to be addressed, right? It's I understand why people are not prison abolitionists generally. So getting into it, I think one of the reasons there's always generally two main ways you can look at something. You can look at things through an economic, practical perspective, and then you can look at things through a moral perspective, right? And I think there's good cases for both for prison abolition. For the practical side first, we can talk about the fact that if someone commits a crime against another person, right? This could be a form of theft, or it could be a worse type of crime. It could be like a murder or a rape. It's not when that person gets sent to jail, that person is being housed and imprisoned, and the people are the taxpayers are paying for that prison stay. Mm-hmm. I think in California, last time I checked, the numbers were like one prisoner costs like $50,000 in taxes each year.
Jesus.
Right? So from an economic perspective, this doesn't help the victim at all whatsoever, right? And in fact, this is true if you look at like how so there's a difference between criminal law and civil law, right? Mm-hmm. So criminal law, generally speaking, is the state incorporating society into a legal structure. So when under criminal law, generally how this arose would be like, if someone committed a crime, it wasn't merely just an infringement against one person to another person. It was an infringement against society. And this is where the state kind of uses their justification for like, this is why we have the say on what happens to this person, as opposed to like, making it restitution based on the victim. So when you have a state-run structure like this, they care more about their own interest and not really the interest of the victim. And this is why you don't ever see the victim actually get anything really in return. So the person being in prison, there's an intuitive, I understand intuitively why people would say, yeah, that's a bad person. He deserves not to be a part of society. I totally get that. But ultimately, putting him in prison is not actually helping the victim, right? And maybe we'll probably get into this more in depth later, but my position would be that the justified thing to do when someone commits a crime is to essentially make the person who committed the crime owe restitution for that crime over time. And while, there's obviously certain crimes that you cannot pay for, you cannot restitute in full, like if someone murders someone else. That's true, but putting them in prison doesn't bring that person back either. So out of all the options, the best one would be making the person pay restitution, probably if it's a murder, maybe for the rest of their life, to the victim's family.
That makes sense. I've always had a problem with prisons, kind of in a sense that's like it's one part they say it's one part restitution, one part not restitution, justice for the victim, separation from society, and then rehabilitation or punishment rehabilitation. Right. And it's like rehabilitation. That's obviously bullshit. There's no one gets I mean, if anyone came out of prison, how to put this, in a healthier mental state when they went in.
Right.
I can't imagine that being the case. You may be better off, but I can't imagine you're healthier, mentally speaking.
Yeah, there's always going to be outliers where you can like pick these anecdotal little points here and there. But in general, most people when they go to prison, even if they weren't violent when they went in necessarily, if they went in for not like a nonviolent crime, they're going to come out, generally speaking, they're going to come out more violent. And this is due to many things. When they're associating with other prisoners in there, they in some sense have to like, this like when in Rome type situation. It's like, well, I'm in prison, so I have to become tough. I have to become hardened. And this generally creates like an internal culture and this negative feedback loop that causes these people to actually solidify their anger or their bad tendencies. Even if they didn't have any tendencies in the past, they create these tendencies to, in some sense, survive better in prison next to these other prisoners. And that's definitely true in like supermax prisons.
We got a question here from Popular Liberty. How would you enforce throughout restitution? Indentured servitude, debtors' prisons?
Yeah,
I don't think the prison abolitionist is going to be for a debtors' prison. I don't know what that is exactly, but
So basically, what would happen is the person would owe a debt, right? They would be you could levy their wages. That could be one way to do it, right? And I think that would be probably the most common way, which is whenever they got paid, the victim's family or the agent for the victim's family could come in and like justifiably take a portion of their wages, right? Another way that it could happen. So people always assume, okay, what's going to happen if they do not comply, right? What's going to happen? What happens to these people if they just refuse to pay the debt? And I like to appeal to some older civilizations and societies and from medieval times and even a little bit earlier, where what they would do, ancient Ireland is one example of this, where they would have what's known as Brehon laws. So things like ancient Ireland, Gospia, they had no prisons or police. So what they did is when someone committed a crime, if they committed that crime and they refused to pay restitution, right, or if they were just uncooperative, whatever, any sort of problem that a person could cause by just not paying restitution, the court system, which was polycentric, would essentially say, okay, you're going to be uncooperative with us. We're not going to defend your rights. In fact, if someone comes along and aggresses against you and essentially like either kills you, robs you or anything, we will not prosecute them. So what this essentially did is it made these people legal outlaws. So that way anyone could essentially kill them or do anything to them. And the court system would just say, well, that's too bad. No, we're not prosecuting it. So what this does is it incentivizes the people, the criminals to comply, or else they're going to be essentially it's going to be open season kind of in some sense on them.
Right? I mean, that makes sense to me because I'm becoming more and more a fan of like the responsibility rights dichotomy kind of thing, and how you have to have obligations to the people around you kind of thing, and otherwise they won't protect. I think that's kind of many people need to learn, and this kind of seems to play into that a little bit instead of
no one has a right. No one has a right to have someone else enforce their rights, right? So you do have to kind of play ball. Well, I think a lot of anarchists don't. I think they should get that point, and some do. I think a lot of people who kind of like coming into this don't get that. And they see anything involving a responsibility for rights is this conservatism, Burkean kind of thing. It's like no. Right. I'm my own person. I'm my man in the woods. And I mean, in an anarchist society, responsibility and your reputation as a person matters much more immensely than it does in a state-based society. So it's very integral. And Bob Murphy in his book Chaos Theory, which is great, I recommend everyone check it out. It's free on Mises. He talks about this sort of. So he talks about like, okay, let's imagine a scenario where the only punishment for killing another human being was you have to pay the family $1,000. Now, in the beginning, there's an understandable shock and horror when people hear this. It's like $1,000 for a human life. That's insane. Now, the $1,000 isn't really relevant. It's just a number. It can be any number you can think, right? So that's not the important part here. The point is, even if we assume that's true, what that means ultimately is that let's say restitution. No one is punished in this society. They just have to make restitution. Well, theoretically, in some sense, you could kill the murderer and just pay the restitution back, right? So even so, like the not punishing goes both ways. So in like an institutional way. So it's like, okay, the murderer isn't going to be punished in some sense, but neither will be the person who killed the murderer, right? So you do see this kind of work out in a natural way, and the incentives, in my view, do align to disincentivize aggression.
I think I have a feeling Andrew here is going to be asking a lot of relevant questions, so I'm kind of just going to pop some of his up here. Ace, is the debt transferable?
Oh, okay. So I'm assuming he means, can I sell the debt to a debt collector? So okay, if you could theoretically, I think, voluntarily sell it to a debt collector, yes, but it can't be transferred from like people involuntarily. So like if you have a debt, your family does not have to pay your debt, right? So if you have a debt, and let's say I have a debt to you, and then I die, the debt, unfortunately, we have to call it a loss, because enforcing the debt on someone else who did not cause the harm would not be justified. So right, in that sense, we would just have to call it clean, which is not fair, but ultimately it would be more unfair to put the debt on someone who had nothing to do with it.
So I want to say this, I'm from the get-go here for a lot of people. Justice systems in any situation are going to be terrible.
Yes.
I recently read John Hasnass's Mr. the Rule of Law recently.
Oh, it's a great essay.
It's amazing. I realized, justice, and no matter what system, is going to suck.
Yeah.
Like, there's no good way of doing the justice system. And kind of like, what's the best we can get? And this is why I kind of like the anarchist take on it. It's like, what's the best we can get that maximizes freedom, anarchy, and like all the stuff. And like, so it kind of sounds outlandish and outside the realm possibility. Compared to what we have now, I don't think it's any worse or better. It's kind of like, it's probably a bit better than what we have now. It's always going to be difficult.
Right. So there's always going to be problems, right? There's always going to be people who try to rule over others. I've said this for a while, but like liberty is a constant struggle. There's no end point, right? There's no, we get to this point and then it's just done. We can go home and we can rest, right? It's not like that. It's like, no, this will always be a problem, but perhaps we can, align incentives in a certain way, or convince a certain amount of people in a certain geographic area to say, okay, we'll try this out. And ultimately, I do think there is historical precedent for it, and I do think it's worked before. And what I'm arguing for also is not something terribly new. Like there a lot of societies, as I was mentioning, like Cospaya, ancient Ireland, these places, they didn't have any police or prisons, and they also weren't like filled with warlords either. Ancient Ireland had there were skirmishes, but within the places themselves, if you compare like the relative peace to like some city in America, the cities often have much more violence, in fact.
Let's get back to the prison abolition a little bit. So we've kind of gone through why we think it's good. What are some common objections outside of this? Like, well, what are you going to do with the murderers? Like, what is, like, you argued about it today, for example. It's like, what is the best argument you've heard against prison abolition? Like, why is prison necessary?
Well, I think that probably is one of the best ones, right? Because I think it's the one that's most intuitive to people, which is that say, well, if we get rid of prisons, then we're going to be overloaded with people in society, and we're just going to have to deal with them, right? So that's so I can understand people's fear there. I understand that, and it's not an unjustified fear. I certainly agree with it. But I think it's prisons are counterproductive, and I didn't touch on this much, but I do think that it is unjustified also from a libertarian perspective, and maybe we can get into that in a little bit. But I also think that I also think the murderers what are we going to do with the murderers and rapists is probably the best argument against it, but I think it's not insurmountable.
What in the case of, like, say, a serial killer who is planning to like recommit again, like they say, I'm gonna do it again, you can't stop me. There's kind of people on the stand who say, you can't stop me. Like the Punisher in Daredevil season 2 is like, I'm gonna do what I want to do. How do you deal with these kind of people when they absent a prison society?
Sure. So I should also be clear. This actually gets into my point a little bit. I am not against restraining people who are aggressors, who are in the process of aggressing, or who are planning to commit future aggressions, right? So if someone wants to restrain that person, I think that's perfectly justified. I think, and we're kind of getting into like one of the beliefs about like libertarianism, is that I believe you have the absolute right to resist aggressors with violence. I think one of the problems with prisons, and in general, I think Rothbard also gets this a little wrong. I think the you don't, yeah, right. you don't have the right to arbitrarily set a certain time when you will like take away someone's rights after they've stopped aggressing, right? So if someone just commits a crime, let's say, right, I don't think there's anything in libertarianism inherently that would say this person now loses his rights for 7 years, right, or something like that. It's pretty arbitrary depending on whatever like some judge picks. So I think if we want to stay really consistent to theory for a little bit, then I think we have to at least acknowledge that, okay, we can stop aggressors, but that doesn't necessarily imply that we have a right to use violence to stop them when they're not aggressing or when they don't seem to be in a position where they will aggress again.
Here's a good one. What about pedophiles? Should they go free?
Well, it depends on what you mean by free. I don't think they should be free to be engage in pedophilia. No. I mean, but right. So like even right now in today's society, there are people who are pedophiles who get out of prison, right, and are free. Obviously, if someone goes to, if a pedophile tries to engage in pedophilia, then you have the absolute right to, use extreme violence against them, right, to put it lightly. So no, they should not be free to engage. They should only be free in the sense that any other person would have a right to be free. It's like as long as they're not aggressing, they're staying within their boundaries, and they're not doing anything untoward to children or anyone. Then they should be free in that sense, but they should not be free to engage in pedophilia as they are.
Before we get into the libertarian side and philosophy side, it's how do I put this? This is one of those libertarian anarchist ideas that like you bring up and people think you're so outside the realm of like what could happen next 100 years.
Yeah.
That I went before I went live, I went to YouTube and I typed in prison abolishment and I saw a bunch of BLM people talking about abolishing prisons and police. They seem to be really stupid and have no good answer for any of it. And it sucks about a lot of good libertarian positions. They get co-opted by really dumb people. So what is something that can be done? Like at what point in the line is prison abolishment a good ideal? Like we have to have how many things we have to have in place before we abolish prisons, before it becomes anarchy in a chaos sense, not in the actual good sense.
Right. Well, I think one of the this is actually more complicated because of the state, right? Because if you oftentimes, and you see this in many states, when you defend yourself in some sense against an aggressor, sometimes you are under prosecution for defending yourself. So the state, but it would complicate matters immensely. So just from a practical perspective, I do think it would be more practical to do it in a way where in states where you don't necessarily in states that are much more open about, you can defend yourself against aggressors, right? Some say more liberal states, you don't see that. I do think things that need to be in place is probably some form of, and we already have this, right? We have, so civil law, essentially when I'm talking about prison abolition, I'm also talking about from a libertarian sense, getting rid of all criminal law, which would be to say that everything would essentially be torts and restitution, essentially, right? So we already have civil law in the United States, and in fact, most societies have civil law, and in fact, it wasn't until the state essentially co-opted law that they started introducing criminal law. If you go back in time to like common law and things like this, you have essentially civil law. So we already have civil law right now. I think civil law plus the ability to adequately defend yourself and a general sense, even a limited sense, property rights enforcement, and you can essentially, I think it would work out, and I think in practical terms, I do think it would be better, right? I think it would also be less burden on the taxpayers as well, obviously. There is one other thing I forgot to mention earlier, which is that Bob Murphy brings up this example in Chaos Theory as well, and I think it's a great point. He talks about like, okay, let's say, and now this would be justified under libertarian grounds, let's say we had a criminal who would not pay restitution, right? So what would happen is more than likely people would not want to do business with him. People would not want to deal with the criminal, and maybe there could be some other criminal conglomeration or something. But for now, let's just talk about the criminal himself. Practically no one would want to do business with the criminal. And what would happen is that he would essentially be socially ostracized in most cases because no one wants to trust this person who obviously, scammed other people or maybe hurt them. Yeah. So what would happen is since he won't pay restitution, more than likely the legal system is not going to defend his rights if he ever got aggressed. So that means that in the society that he's in right now, he would essentially be an open target. And this would incentivize him to leaving that society. And you could imagine these market firms that could arise where they would be like, okay, look, they would mimic prisons in some sense, where it'd be like, okay, look, you're free to come and go as you wish. But if you're being ostracized from society, if you stay here and you work for us and you don't leave the perimeters, we'll defend your rights for you, but you're not allowed to leave.
Yeah.
Or you can leave, but once you leave, you're no longer under our protection.
It's like a voluntary rehab facility.
Yes, exactly. Correct. So this could also be another way that you could institute this. And I think that's very practical.
I was recently reading Pat's work by Yarvin, which I know you have some issues with, but I think overall it's a great prediction of how company communities are going to like operate.
Yeah.
It's easy to, my notes, I'm having Jay on talk about it soon, actually.
Yeah.
And my notes are basically you could see a chaos series style prison city states that people would just like to stay with.
Yeah.
It seems very it seems crazy when you think of everything as it is now, like the state is basically this giant 50-50 landmass. But when you actually break it down like city by city, covenant community, it's not so outlandish as people think.
Right. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Question from Sauce. I'm not gonna try to pronounce it. Why not just abolish imprisonment for non-violent offenders, but keep aggressors like pedophiles, murders, and rapists locked up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, which was like obviously everyone. I think every libertarian already agrees that non-violent people shouldn't be locked up, right?
Yeah.
I think the practical answer to, or the economic reason why you should abolish it for everyone is, one, it's a burden on the taxpayers. It does not bring actual like justice to, or it does not make the victims whole. And obviously for a murderer, you can't really make them whole, but restitution is at least a step closer than that, than making the victim pay for the criminal, stay in prison, right? It's like, that's almost insult to injury levels of, so, because when you understand the prisons are, state-based institutions that don't actually help bring justice. Because remember, the criminal law ultimately is the criminal against society. It's not, the victim is just there. The victim is there and he's at trial, but that's not the point of the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system says you have harmed society and we're going to try to rectify that through retribution. Now, from a libertarian perspective, I do think that if you have committed an aggression, the aggression is wrong, but I don't think there's any logical implication past that point where it says that, okay, after you've committed the aggression, we now get to use force on you, even if you're not being aggressive in the future, right? So some people believe that you just lose your rights entirely after you've aggressed at all. And I don't see anything in libertarianism that would ever imply that, even if that's like an intuitive, like instinctual thing for people. Now, truthfully speaking, right, if someone like murdered one of my family members, I would absolutely like understand and probably myself want to seek retribution for it. But I think in exact libertarian theory, I don't think institutionally this would be justified.
Yeah. I had a joke a while when I was like first coming into this libertarian thing. It's like, if you're a victim of some kind of crime, why go to the police when you can just sue them? Because if you sue them, you're gonna make money off of it, and if you go to jail, it takes longer. Probably that's not gonna get effective, and you have to pay for the room and board.
That's right.
Sue them. It makes more sense. It's a joke, but in reality, it's like, no, you should be suing more people instead of going to criminal courts.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean it's like punish, like even with prisons, as we're saying, it doesn't bring really any justice to the family, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously, what we were saying before, there's no perfect answer, right? If someone has murdered someone, there's nothing that we can do that can bring that person back. But at least like making that murderer pay restitution for the rest of his life to the victim's family would at least be, I think, better than the state locking them away because they infringed on society in some way.
Yeah. Here's one from Andrew. Ace, in the biblical anarcho covenant, murder, pedophile, rape, etc. were all capital crimes, no prison needed. Would you object to that in principle?
In principle, I would, because I don't. One of the reason I'm against prisons is because I don't think punishment is morally justified. Now, when I say that, or justified by libertarian theory. So when I say that, I concede that, like as we were just talking about, like I concede if someone like harmed me or my family in some way, I probably would want to take retribution against them. Now the thing is, while I wouldn't justify that on libertarian grounds, if I'm someone who believes that punishment is wrong and someone goes out and kills their rapist or their family's murderer, I don't want that person punished either. right?
Yeah.
So you can kind of see how that kind of would work out in a practical sense, even if I disagree with it in a theory sense.
Yeah. I had a question earlier. I can't remember what it was now. I remember what it was now. Jared in Democracy had a tweet recently about bring back stoning people and kicking them out of your area.
Yeah.
What I think is, again, much better than prison. Was people,
Yeah.
one of the claims they make up prison is separated from society. And it's like, well, if you're going to separate it from society, why don't we just kick them out of the community?
Right.
That makes much more sense. I want to have too many questions because it's kind of a straightforward thing. Let's get into like the arguments for, like, when people bring it up. Because I saw today people had some crazy. People react to it kind of like, oh, you're a crazy person because you want to have rapists walking
It's
free.
like when a state first encounters anarchism or something. It's like, their first reaction.
Who would build the roads?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Have you had any personal experience to talk about this in person with people? Like, have you brought this up in person with anybody? Or have you only done it like online?
It's mostly been online. I don't get to it just doesn't come up in natural conversation for me in my daily life usually, and like talking about like prisons just usually don't come up too much, so it's mostly online.
Yeah, and they come from me quite a bit because I'm in a group chat with a guy going to law school. My former youth pastor, and so we're constantly arguing about like what should you do with prisoners, and I get into a lot because I say I'm against the death penalty. Yeah. And they're like, what if he's going to commit again? It's like, we can't punish someone for a possible future crime.
This is another point. That the whole point of like, well, we need to deter future crimes, right? So this is also an argument people will give, right? So they usually give two main arguments, which is we need to enact retribution, or we need to use it to deter crimes, future crimes. One, if you're doing it for deterrence, you're doing it because you think this person might commit again. What you're engaged in is pre-crime. Right, you're trying to justify your belief that prison is justified because this person might commit again, but there's no reason you can like just because someone has committed a crime in the past, it doesn't logically imply that they will or it's inevitable that they will commit again. Right, we just don't have that knowledge. So because of that, while they're guilty of the crime they committed, I would argue that they're not guilty of any future crime you may think they might commit. Right, because that itself would be pre-crime, and if we have to apply innocence until proven guilt, and that's on a case-by-case, crime-by-crime basis. So one of the reasons you have to take that into account is if you don't take that into account, maybe if your base layer justification for prison in general is, well, we have to deter criminals. Well, if you logically extrapolate that out and you have no other like principle to mediate that principle, it seems that you could justify hurting innocent people to deter crimes, right? It's like, or maybe like someone commits a small crime and like, well, we have to punish this person because we have to show these criminals that we're going to enforce the small laws, the minor laws, really harshly to deter them, right? So
broken window policies or something.
Yeah, exactly. So if deterrence is just your goal, that would, if you have no other mediating principles, I was saying, it would seem that you would kind of justify anything. You could justify torturing anyone to say, oh yeah, we're doing this for the greater good, so that this creates an disincentive for people to commit aggression in the future. And I think that would just be flatly out unjustified.
Yeah, I want to talk more about the debt side of things, a few hypotheticals, because this is actually what I'm we'll go from popularity because I'll forget to do it later. Yeah, but Ace, recidivism is often precise. It's often precisely because no one wants to do business with them, which is what they're advocating for and the means of justice.
Sure. Well, no. When I'm saying that, okay, that's true. But one of the reasons that's true also is that you have to factor in today's society, which people in prison, because people have this instinctual idea that if a person's been to prison, then they must be, a bad person. And this makes them less likely to be able to get a job in society and engage in society. And it's true, it does lead into more recidivism. My distinction here with what I was arguing was, if you took an anarchist society, or if you just took the system I was talking about, where it's like this person can make restitution, if they make restitution for their crime, then they're probably going to be seen as more of a more upstanding criminal compared to a criminal who does not, right? So just because if they've been to prison and they get released, you don't know if they've been on good behavior or not. You don't know like what their actions were in prison, right? All they know is that you have a criminal record. So this
is like when you apply for a job.
Yes.
And you put down like, I was in prison for mail fraud, and it's like, well, we see prison, you're not going to get the job.
Yeah, they see prison, and then it's terrible for people who have been to prison. So in my example, the person is incentivized not only to pay the restitution because their rights wouldn't be protected if they did not, generally, but they'd also be incentivized to do it because they would be able to be reintegrated into society if they did pay the restitution and they did show that they were on good behavior. So there are multiple like incentive benefits to this system over prisons, because when most people see prisons, they can assume the worst, right? Whereas if in some sense, if the criminal is in the public space still, in that sense where it's like they can be seen and they can be seen to be being good on their word, then they're probably more likely to be more integrated into like social life than a criminal who doesn't, or a criminal who's been in prison, certainly.
Yeah. So on the point of like on the debt and restitution.
Yeah.
Let's give a hypothetical. Someone under the age of 18 runs someone else over. Manslaughter.
Yeah.
The person under 18, say the 16 just started driving. Do they owe the restitution, or does the family cover it to they are of age? Like, how would that hypothetical work out?
So I would argue that the guardian would owe the restitution, probably because they are responsible for their ward, essentially, right, or their child. So yeah, I would say that in that case the guardian would owe it because they are the one responsible for it. But I do think that if they are at age where they have a job and they can work, then I would actually probably say that it is the child's fault, or not the child, but the teenager's fault. So that's probably how I'd do it. It would depend. It depends on age, and it's more of like, do they have the capability to pay it back, essentially, or do they have a job, or are they in that like mental headspace where that's applicable to them? So I would say it depends, but I could see a case for both.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Like we have now is like, oh, the person's not mentally capable of, say, committing a crime, but they did a crime by accident, kind of thing. It's like juvie, special prison, special needs kind of situations. It is very interesting to kind of think about all the implications this could have. It's very out there for people listening, but I think it's not that there to really think about it.
Yeah.
I missed one on. Do you see that mentality of not wanting to associate with criminals changing? I don't.
Well, I think there's certainly I don't know, but I would certainly say there's a stigma around prison in particular. And I mean, obviously for good reason, in the sense that it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy or a feedback loop, a negative feedback loop, people get in prison. But I think in general, in American society, especially with prisons, I think there kind of is this idea that if you go to prison, you're just like a monster, right? And this sort of goes to like this almost conservative belief where it's like, if conservatives often see a cop, and this is not just true for conservatives, but liberals too, but if a person sees a cop arresting someone, their immediate assumption is that, oh, that's a bad person, right? Because if your immediate assumption is, well, the cops are the good guys, so they by definition they must be arresting the bad guy.
It's just something I've started noticing is if it was you see a breaking news story, someone was arrested for something. It's in all comments, death sentence, long life sentence. Like he was arrested.
We don't know if he's actually guilty.
Exactly. It's like if you go on trial for something, and if you prove it innocent, it doesn't really matter. Your reputation's like gone.
Exactly.
Everyone assumes guilt. It's
yes.
One of the most frustrating things I've noticed recently, and I can't. It's so stupid too. It's not like I can't really see a good argument. Like if you claim you believe innocent proven guilty, why you like this? Cop TV.
And you see that with Ross, like comments with Ross Ulbricht all the time too. I was arguing with someone today, but that's a whole separate topic. But
I had you wrong for that one.
But yeah, no. So to Popular Liberty's point, I don't know. I can't really say in the sense that whether it would be like every criminal, or people would generally view criminals as being okay to associate with in society. But I certainly think it would be better than it is now with prisons. I certainly think that would be an improvement in the sense that if people in general can see that the criminal is making good on their word. Because here's the thing with prison, right? When they're put into prison, they're taking out of the public eye. They're taking out of the public imagination. So what this does is that when they're in prison, there's an immediate assumption that if they're in prison, they must be a bad person. And even if they did a bad thing, even if they committed a crime, it doesn't necessarily entail that they're always going to be a bad person. So when someone's in prison, for example, it can lead the mind to wander because the general public doesn't know what that person has been doing. They don't know what that person's been up to in prison. They don't know how good or bad they were in prison. Whereas if they're out in the open, people can more clearly make a value judgment based on that person's actions, on if they're performing to their duties based on the crime they committed. So I would say that's probably the what I would say to that. I think it would be much better for people to just be able to determine which criminals or which people who have committed crimes in the past are better to associate with than ones that have not.
That's the point I'm going to bring up is I'm against sex offender registries. I saw that one debate at the Soho Forum at one Tom Woods episode, and it was kind of like, oh, these sex offender registries are dumb and don't make sense. But when you're talking about like people seeing them making restitution, do we have like an offender registry for this? People can see, hey, you did this 15 years ago and you're still paying restitution for it. Are we substituting a sex offender registry for a offender registry here? Like, how does this work?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think you could have a registry in some sense, right? In the same way that, like, often what would happen with criminals, like in these medieval times, is that they would essentially say, or like they would essentially say, this person has not been good on their word, and they would essentially like spread their name throughout town and do it. So I think that is one way you could do it, and I think there's still there's still problems with that, right? There's no perfect solutions here, but I certainly think that that's probably. It's more advantageous to the public at large to be able to see exactly who is making restitution and who is not, right? You can imagine any type of like organizations that could distribute that type of information to the general public, which criminal from which crime was paying restitution, right? You could have an open database of stuff like that. So I think that would probably, be much better. And as you said, it would go to reputation, which is, I think, crucial if we're talking about like an anarchist or free society.
Yeah, that's one thing I think where I would love to see it come back is like reputations of people and make it actually have an impact. By now, no one cares who anybody is. I would love to see that kind of come back into action. Because I brought it up, I feel like I have to clarify something. The sex registries being bad, people hear that and they don't know what I'm talking about and why it's bad. Do you want to clarify real quick why sex registries are stupid and shouldn't exist?
Sure. Well, most people, when they hear you're a sex offender or you're on the sex registry, they immediately think you're a pedophile, right? That's the first immediate assumption is that most people make. But this could mean, and what this has meant for a lot of people is that when they were 16 years old, they sent a nude photograph to some other 16-year-old. And now they're on the sex offender registry, right? So
public urination, all sorts of nonsense is on.
Yeah, exactly. It's insane. If you actually look into it, all the stories of the people who are on there, it's completely unjustified, right? These people are no threat to anyone, and it ruins people's lives like that. It's like a scarlet letter on their reputation. So, and because people have that stigma in their mind that, oh, this person must be a pedophile, then it just assumes there's that intuition or that immediate assumption most people make where, oh, this person is bad. And also, there's been people who are like, why don't we just go look at everyone on the sex offender list and just go kill them? It's like, what are you talking about? That's insane. It's like you're acting like a thug.
It really is. What was it? I watch a lot of cop shows, not as much as I used to because I can't get past all. Like, it's kind of fun to watch public propaganda.
Yeah, sure.
They did an episode in the sex offender registry about a guy who got killed by his neighbors because he was on a sex offender registry, and it's like he just public urination, but because they don't clarify what it is that he did as a sex offender, he got killed, and it's like I can imagine this happening. Like you very easily imagine this happening, and it doesn't lead to recidivism or repeat offense. Like it doesn't. Repeat offenses in sexual crimes, it's not that high. Like it's very low. And this does not help. It actually hurts it. And so there's really no reason to have a sex offender registry.
Right. Yeah.
We got a bunch here from Andrew. I'm going to go through each of these real quick.
Okay, sure.
I think it's more consistent to say we can use multiple reasons for having the justice system, deterrence, restitution, and this. Oh, my eyes are hurting me. Are decent reasons, and they are not mutually exclusive.
Well, I mean, you could say that, right? You could say like they're reasons in the sense that they purport to have outcomes that we might find desirable. But I think that my point against it would be that retribution and deterrence specifically aren't necessarily consistent with libertarian theory. And I know and I know most libertarians, when they hear that, that is probably a shock to them because they think, and also, right, I do think Rothbard gets this a little wrong. But the reason for it is that, as I think I talked about deterrence before, where it's like, just because a person has committed a crime in the past, it does not imply that they're going to commit a crime in the future. So punishing them in some sense to either stop them from committing a crime in the future, or to stop someone else from committing a crime in the future, seems completely unjustified to me, because that's going into pre-crime, right? We could justify any number of horrible things with a deterrence mindset specifically. Retribution, I mean, I can understand like a family member's like wanting to have retribution, right? I totally get that, and I can't say that I would think or feel any differently if I was in their situation. But I would say I don't think that I think if we strictly stay with the non-aggression principle here, I don't think that there is a logical way we can say, and I know there's some theories like estoppel that Stefan Kinsella has introduced, but I'm not a huge fan of that or subscribe to it. I have problems with it, but I don't want to get into that right now because that's a whole other can of worms. But retribution, I think ultimately you can't just, like, if the NAP says you are justified in responding to aggressors with violence to stop the aggression, right? So if someone is trying to kill me, I have the right to kill them. But if someone stands on my toe, let's say, I don't have the right to kill them or like knock them headfirst into a wall or something like that. I merely have the right to like exclude them from my boundaries. And this also gets into property rights, where it's like, the reason a person can make rules on their property, right? The reason I have a right to set rules is actually a de facto right from the natural right I have to exclude others, right? So the reason I have a right to like make my own rules is because I can exclude others, which implies that I have the right to set the terms on my property's use, right? So ultimately, all libertarian theory is about the right to exclude others. That does not include the right to necessarily punish others. So if someone breaks a rule on my property, I have the right to exclude them, but I don't necessarily have the right to punish them, right? So that's one of the reasons why is like, you don't like, if a person aggressed at one point, it doesn't necessarily imply that they've lost their rights after the aggression has occurred.
Have you and Andrew done any podcast besides the one on Jose's channel?
No.
I feel like if you guys had a good moderated with a timer, you guys would have a great conversation. But you guys. Yeah. It could be. I would love to host it, but I would have that to be strict with, like, here's a timer, can't go past this timer,
right?
Seed time. Otherwise, I see it's very hectic. But it'd be really enjoyable for anybody listening, because you're both just fantastic.
No, thank you.
Here's the next one from Andrew. If Chaos making C's pay retribution, are you okay with making them pay very simple 2, 3, 5, etc. Multiple retribution in order to skew the risk versus reward prospect towards risk?
Oh, so like making them pay more than like okay. So like in terms of a thief, yeah. So you can certainly, I would certainly say you can make them pay not just for what they stole, but also for the cost that was incurred by trying to catch the thief, right? And I do think Rothbard kind of gets us right, where it's like, if a thief steals something and then all the costs that went into retrieving the property back from them, also the thief would have to pay. So I would do that. I wouldn't say that you can like say like, I stole $2 from you and now you have to, now I have to pay you like $200, right? I would think that would, and I know that's not what you're saying, so I don't want to straw man you, but I think that type of thinking would kind of lead to that in some sense. So I understand what you're saying in the sense that would be better from an incentive perspective, in the sense that it would say this would really disincentivize theft. But I think we also have to balance incentives and rights, right? So just because it would lead to an incentive, maybe, then it wouldn't necessarily be in line with a rights-based theory.
Making restitution multiple reform multiplies uniform and simple makes it easy to calculate whether it's risk or not.
So on this, on theft, I tend to agree. On other crimes, so like people always have this objection, which is they'll say, well, if you commit a crime, if a very wealthy person commits a crime, right? Couldn't they just keep committing the crimes and keep paying? Well, there's a couple of reasons I don't think that would happen, which is some of the reasons I've given before. But another is that it could be scaled, the restitution paid could be scaled to their status in society. So if they were a very wealthy person, might have to pay much more than if a poor person killed someone. So the arbiter could scale I do think could scale the restitution based on that in some regard, based on like the accountability that this person had based on their status.
I'm going to bring up an obvious object people are going to say is that if you have rich people killing poor people and you have a judge, it's easy for a judge who also is probably rich to be friendly with the rich person.
Oh,
and
okay.
The system is full of corruption, but every justice system is going to be full of corruption. There is no real answer to
So
it.
the question isn't wouldn't a system without corruption be great? It's which system can we best identify the corrupt people in society, and which system can we best fix that corruption, or at least disassociate with that corruption, right? So you have to think, okay, let's assume this corruption is a constant of human nature. If we assume that, a centralized system is going to have much more like corruption, and you're not going to be able to deal with that corruption in an effective way because of the centralized structure is going to, in some sense, reinforce it. So to your question, if you had a very rich person killing someone, and then the judge was like backing that rich person, that judge probably could stay in business in some sense. That arbiter could stay in business because they're getting funneled money from this rich person. But most people would not want to go to that arbiter ever again if they knew that some like corporation was like backing this judge specifically, and they would not be forced to go to that arbiter either. So they could just disassociate. In this, so yeah, that's true that like there could be problems, and I'm not saying there would be no corruption, obviously. But it's like, as you said, it's like, okay, which system would be better to deal with the corruption?
Now, I have a friend who's an engineering type, and I don't talk politics with him because he doesn't live in reality. Like his answer was, the problem with government is all the money. We talk the money out of politics. I'm like, and I want to sort out of the ocean. You're not speaking in reality here, dude.
Right,
the judge is a problem regardless of the system. Yes. I had a judge who was a Calvinist, as my scoutmaster in Boy Scouts. Impossible to deal with. I don't like judges. First of all, I don't like lawyers in general. So a judge is like a next level lawyer. It's even more annoying. But I don't think history shows that centralized or decentralized system of justice are much different. Judicial corruption is pretty consistent.
In terms of common law, I would disagree. I think when you have I didn't say that it was different. I just said that it was more flexible, right? So what you want is, in a decentralized system, if a judge is corrupt in a polycentric legal order, you can disassociate with that judge, and you don't have to like be forced to see that judge. So I think if a judge is corrupt, it's in the same way that, would you rather want a corrupt government or a corrupt business, right? Like a corrupt business, okay, this business is obviously corrupt, but you don't have to enter, you don't have to buy their products, you don't have to do anything they want. Whereas when there's corruption in a centralized system like a state, the cost of that corruption is you're going to feel the direct effects of the corruption, and you're going to be paying for the corruption in some sense through your own tax money. So I think we can't stop the corruption, but we can, in a decentralized system, we can disassociate with it much more effectively than in a centralized system.
This is there was no good solution to justice. That is something that like was the I've only realized that probably like in the past month or so, and that's something we talk to people. I talk to people now about things on Twitter in person. It's like, no matter what you bring up in justice, it's gonna suck.
There's no way we can ever ever get to like a platonic view of like justice. We can never meet a platonic view of justice. And I think in some sense, there's almost a hyperfixation on justice, and I get why, but I think I would prefer peace in some sense to justice most of the time, merely because I think a hyperfixation on justice actually is counterproductive and leads to injustice, right? You can see this in certain ways. It's like, if we believe that we have to go and we have to bring this person to justice no matter the cost, it's like, okay, well, that cost now is more injustice, right, on your way to bring about justice. And also just with the corruption, it's like, we'll never have a perfect justice system, even in a decentralized order. But the problem is the point is the decentralized order has much more superiority compared to a centralized one, just due to economic incentives.
That's why I'm not passing on this debate with Ace. There's no good solutions. I'm pretty open-minded and flexible on the topic.
I mean, that's fair, but I think my point my position on this comes mainly from a moral perspective, and also, but I do think there's very good economic and consequentialist arguments for it, which is to say that I do think that, one of the prisons is that, we were talking about the stigma people have with prisoners. And it's like, it's really awful that I think a large majority of these people, and, even if there's some people you want in there, a large majority of these people do not deserve to be in there, and they're essentially just forgotten about from society, right? These people are never thought about again, except by their families. And it's just, these people are just like removed out of the minds of every person in society. And I think that is a very unfortunate, and it leads to unjust suffering of those prisoners. And I think that's why, in some sense, having the prisoners out in the open is actually better, because you can distinguish which of these criminals are actually worth like reintegrating into society, and which you just want to arm yourself and stay away from.
Yeah, we are running out of time. Yeah. What are some great topic books, articles? I'm sure there's there's a literature on everything. What is some literature if I could put in the description for this video?
So Against the Criminal Justice System is a libertarian series of essay or writing articles by Jason Baez. And I think they're probably one of the best pieces of libertarian literature on this topic in general. I think it's 4 to 5 parts. I'll link them to you after the show. But I think that's probably where you should start. Roderick Long has a great piece. I forget the exact title, and I feel horrible for it, but I believe it's like it's talking about restitution. I'm blanking on the title right now, but I'll be sure to also link that to you afterwards.
Sounds good.
Yeah. There's the book Just Mercy is a great book. I think you should. I had my friend Mel talk me into that one. That's a great book. I think people should read too. I think they also made a movie about it. One of my last points here is, I think that even if you think that, so let's say you're not persuaded, right? Let's just say you still think prisons are good. I would like to bring up a statistic here that I think, even if you're not a prison abolitionist, you have to think, oh my God, that's horrible. I believe it's not something like 90% of convictions in America come from plea deals. And what this means for most people is that maybe libertarians don't think about this too much, but plea deals are coerced confessions. So if we assume that you're innocent until proven guilty, let's say, right? The assumption is that you're innocent until proven guilty. And then someone comes up with a plea deal that says, look, you admit to this, and you're going to face less time if you get sentenced than if we sentence you, right? Mm-hmm. This is a coerced confession, which means while they were presumed innocent, they were threatened to admit to the crime to get a lower time. Mm-hmm. So if we assume that's 90%, like if that statistic is accurate, and it's like around 90%, then what that means is that there are 90% of people who at the very least deserve trials and should not be there. So even if you're not like a libertarian, even if you're not a prison abolitionist, I think you're committed, if you believe in innocence prior to guilt and you are against coerced confessions, that 90% of these people are just out or have free trials or trials in the first place.
Anyone listening, there was a fantastic video from Don Stosser called on YouTube, called Classic Stosser Mandatory Minimums. It was my favorite Stosser video. I was saying that one I watched that with my dad, and he's boomer con as fuck, and it red pilled him on the court system. He was like, "Oh, this isn't good." Like, it's once you see that, you're like, "Oh, this is obvious. This is entirely corrupt system, so people could run for office later." Like it turns out partisan, so it's even like doubly evil.
Right. Yeah.
But well, I think that's all the questions I had. We got some little stuff in the description later. Yeah, we'll go. Oh, I wanted to ask you, Ace.
Yeah.
I didn't ask you this last time. What are 3 books in general? Just any book you think people should read?
Oh, on just any topic. On just like
any topic. Yeah, topic? Any 3 books.
Okay. Oh gosh. Well, considering your audience, I'm sure most people have read Anatomy of the State. I might go out there, and I might. So I think I'll recommend The Myth of Sisyphus, just for a philosophy book by Albert Camus. I love that book. Or it's more closer to an essay than a book, but and then I'll probably say, fiction wise, I think I love Huckleberry Finn. I'm a huge fan of Huckleberry Finn.
I read it for the first time last year. I'm like, this was a kid's book, and there's like some legit questions, and like when Jim, I'm not gonna say his name in the book, but when Jim's talking about like going back and getting his wife and daughter, and Hook's like conflicted, like I'm hoping a guy steal more people, and he's like conflicted over it. I'm like, this is a kid's book, and that's a really good ethical question about the times from a kid, and it's great.
If I can just say something about, and it's gonna be a kind of a spoiler of the book, so if you haven't read it, I'm sorry, or it's an old book, but if there's a moment closer to the end, it's the moral climax of the book. And so the premise of the book is that Huckleberry Finn is this kid, and he rescues he goes on an adventure with this escaped slave, right? And they go down the Mississippi River on a raft, and they have all these adventures together. That's the general premise. Huck has been told all his life that if he helps a slave escape, or if he frees a slave, he's going to be sent to hell, right? He's going to be punished eternally, damned for eternity in hell. And there's a moral climax in the book, which I think is one of the most incredible moments in all of fiction, which is when Huck is just distraught over this because he's feeling so much guilt over the fact that he helped this slave escape, essentially. And he's writing a letter to Jim, the slave's owner, where she can retrieve her slave, right? And he's holding the note in his hand, and he's shaking, he's trembling. He's talking about like how he can't even pray because he's so distraught, and how it's the first time he's going to be able to choose once and for all between two different outcomes, two things. And he's thinking about how society and his family and everything told him that you're going to be sent to hell if you free a slave. So he's so distraught over this, and he holds the note in his hand, and he says, "All right, I'll go to hell." And he tears it up. And yeah, it's such an amazing moment, but I think it's one of the most beautiful moral moments in any book ever.
It's a fantastic book. I loved it. I listened to the audiobook on Audible is done by Elijah Wood.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It's weird hearing him say the N-word. It's kind of funny hearing Frodo Baggins just dropping N-bombs every other sentence, but it's still a fantastic book.
And
so good. Anyone listening, I think it's included on your Audible membership. Like, definitely check it out.
Yeah,
I can't recommend it enough. It's amazing.
It's so good. Yeah.
Well, with that, Ace, where can people find you at?
So you can find me on Twitter at Ace_Archist. And I'm a co-host of the Slurp Gang podcast, which is nothing like this. It's more just, a bunch of dudes just joking around. So if you're interested in that, if that's something you're interested in, you can check that out at Slurp Gang at pretty much any podcatcher. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. And this is a topic that I think is very important. And I wish libertarians would at least interact with it more seriously, even if they don't agree.
Yeah, that's something I noticed is like it doesn't seem brought up as much as like silver asset forces or other things.
Right.
Like, it seems like a pretty big thing.
Yes.
Brought up more.
Yeah, 100%. So thank you so much for having me.
It's no problem. Well, guys, another episode of Face, Liberty, and Praxis. Hit like and subscribe. Share the video. Have a good night.